For a brief moment, Erwin Rommel embodied everything Adolf Hitler wanted the German war effort to project: speed, audacity, victory, and myth. Rommel was not just winning battles, he was winning headlines. Photographs, newsreels, and propaganda turned him into the face of German success, a commander who seemed to defy odds and embarrass his enemies. But that same independence, the very quality that made Rommel useful early on, would eventually make him dangerous in Hitler's eyes. Rommel's rise was unusually fast. Unlike many senior German commanders, he was not a product of the old Prussian aristocracy. He was a frontline officer, intensely practical, focused on battlefield reality rather than ideology or tradition. Hitler admired this. Rommel spoke plainly, acted decisively, and delivered results, especially in France in 1940 and later in North Africa. To Hitler, Rommel appeared loyal, effective, and refreshingly unburdened by the caution that defined much of the German high command. But this relationship was never built on mutual understanding. It was built on usefulness. Hitler trusted Rommel as long as Rommel confirmed his worldview, that boldness could overcome material disadvantage, that willpower could replace logistics, and that defeat was always the result of insufficient faith or hesitation. As long as Rommel's victories supported that narrative, trust remained intact. The problem began when the war stopped behaving as Hitler expected. In North Africa, Rommel quickly discovered the limits of improvisation. Fuel shortages, overstretched supply lines, and Allied naval dominance made sustained success impossible. Rommel adapted by telling uncomfortable truths. He reported logistical realities honestly. He warned that victories could not be sustained without resources. He asked for withdrawals when positions became untenable. From a military perspective, this was competence. From Hitler's perspective, it sounded dangerously close to doubt. At first, these warnings were tolerated. Rommel still had prestige. His name still carried weight. But cracks were forming. Hitler increasingly surrounded himself with officers who reinforced his beliefs rather than challenged them. Realism began to look like pessimism. Caution began to look like disloyalty. Rommel, who spoke directly and expected decisions grounded in reality, was slowly drifting out of alignment with the Führer's mindset. This divergence deepened as the war turned decisively against Germany. By 1943 and 1944, Hitler demanded absolute certainty, absolute obedience, and absolute optimism. Rommel offered none of these. He argued for flexible defense. He questioned rigid, stand-fast orders. He believed that refusing to adapt was suicidal. These views were shared by many professional officers, but Rommel was more visible than most, and therefore more threatening. What truly unsettled Hitler was not that Rommel disagreed. It was that Rommel was respected enough to be listened to. Soldiers admired him. Civilians knew his name. Even enemy commanders acknowledged his skill. That combination, military credibility and independent thinking, was intolerable in a regime that increasingly relied on fear and ideological conformity to maintain control. Trust does not usually collapse in a single moment. It erodes. In Rommel's case, it eroded as he became less useful as a symbol and more dangerous as a realist. Hitler did not stop trusting Rommel because Rommel failed. He stopped trusting him because Rommel began to see the war as it was, not as Hitler wanted it to be. By the time Rommel returned to Europe and took responsibility for defending the Atlantic Wall, the relationship had fundamentally changed. Rommel still believed he was serving Germany by telling the truth. Hitler had begun to believe that truth itself was the enemy. This was the quiet turning point. Rommel was no longer just a general. He was a problem. By the time Erwin Rommel was reassigned to defend Western Europe, the trust that once defined his relationship with Adolf Hitler had already thinned to something conditional. Rommel was no longer viewed primarily as a symbol of victory, but as a commander whose assessments conflicted with the narrative Hitler demanded. The shift was subtle but decisive. Rommel had not changed his loyalty. Hitler had changed what loyalty meant. The Atlantic Wall exposed this conflict immediately. Rommel approached the task with brutal honesty. After inspecting the coast, he concluded that Germany could not win a prolonged battle inland against Allied air superiority and material strength. The invasion, he believed, had to be stopped at the beaches, or Germany would lose the West entirely. This assessment clashed directly with Hitler's belief that decisive battles could still be fought deeper inland, where reserves could be maneuvered for a crushing counterattack. To Hitler, Rommel's focus on the beaches sounded like defeatism. To Rommel, Hitler's plan ignored reality. Rommel did not soften his warnings. He spoke openly to fellow commanders, wrote candid reports, and argued relentlessly for immediate practical changes: more obstacles, more mines, forward-deployed armor. His urgency was not political, it was professional. He believed time was running out. But in Hitler's inner circle, urgency without optimism was unacceptable. Rommel's realism began to isolate him. This isolation worsened as Hitler's leadership style hardened. As setbacks mounted elsewhere, dissent became intolerable. Hitler increasingly demanded assurances of success, not assessments of risk. Commanders who echoed his beliefs were rewarded. Those who questioned them were sidelined. Rommel found himself surrounded by rivals who framed caution as weakness and portrayed flexibility as lack of resolve. The language of military planning was being replaced by the language of loyalty. What made Rommel especially dangerous was that he did not conspire in secret. He argued in daylight. He did not cloak his concerns in flattery. He assumed that professional judgment still mattered. That assumption was fatal. In a regime driven by ideology and fear, honesty became indistinguishable from opposition. Rommel was not accused of treason, but he was no longer fully trusted. Hitler's perception of Rommel shifted again after D-Day. The invasion validated Rommel's warnings. Allied forces established beachheads quickly, supported by overwhelming air and naval power. The kind of inland counterattack Hitler had envisioned never materialized. But instead of restoring trust, this only deepened suspicion. Rommel's correctness made him more dangerous, not less. Being right highlighted Hitler's misjudgment, and Hitler did not forgive that. Behind closed doors, Rommel's name began to carry a different tone. He was described as pessimistic, overly cautious, insufficiently committed to victory. None of these accusations were about competence. They were about alignment. Rommel was no longer seen as someone who reinforced belief. He was someone who challenged it. The irony was brutal. Rommel was doing exactly what a responsible commander should do, adapting to reality, learning from the enemy, and adjusting plans accordingly. But reality itself had become politically unacceptable. Hitler no longer wanted generals who saw clearly. He wanted generals who believed absolutely. This was the moment when military disagreement crossed into political danger. Rommel had not opposed Hitler openly. He had simply refused to lie, to himself or to others, about the war's direction. In a system that demanded obedience over truth, that refusal was enough. Rommel was still in command. He was still respected. But the foundation of trust was gone. From this point forward, every action he took would be interpreted through suspicion. And once a regime begins to fear a man's judgment more than his disloyalty, the outcome is rarely in doubt. By mid-1944, Erwin Rommel was no longer evaluated by what he achieved, but by what he represented. His battlefield judgments, once valued for their clarity, were now filtered through suspicion. Inside the upper reaches of the German command, Rommel had become something far more dangerous than a dissenting officer, a credible, alternative voice. He did not need to plot or conspire. His mere presence and the respect he commanded posed a problem for a regime that had begun to fear reality itself. Rommel's situation worsened as events unfolded exactly as he had predicted. Allied air power dominated the skies. German movements were exposed, delayed, and disrupted. Rigid orders to hold ground resulted in needless losses. Each development reinforced Rommel's earlier warnings, and each validation quietly undermined Adolf Hitler's authority. In an authoritarian system, being proven right at the wrong time can be fatal. Rommel's accuracy did not restore trust. It eroded it further. The regime's response was not debate, but distance. Rommel was increasingly bypassed in decision-making. His recommendations were delayed, diluted, or ignored. Communication became selective. Access narrowed. Other commanders, less capable but more ideologically aligned, found favor. This was not an accident. It was a containment strategy of a different kind. Isolate the man whose realism threatened the myth. Rommel sensed the change. He understood that his influence was shrinking, even as the situation deteriorated. Yet he did not retreat into silence. He continued to argue for flexibility, for withdrawals when necessary, for decisions grounded in the balance of forces rather than faith. Each intervention deepened the perception that he was out of step. In a system where obedience had replaced judgment, Rommel's professionalism became evidence against him. The turning point came as Germany's internal atmosphere grew increasingly paranoid. Loyalty was no longer measured by actions, but by tone. Optimism became mandatory. Doubt became incriminating. Rommel, who spoke plainly and without ideological varnish, fit poorly into this environment. He was not reckless enough for Hitler's fantasies and not pliable enough for the court politics that now dominated Berlin. At the same time, Rommel's public image remained powerful. Soldiers admired him, civilians recognized him, even the enemy respected him. This duality, declining influence at the top, enduring respect below, made him uniquely threatening. Regimes built on control fear figures who cannot be easily discredited. Rommel's reputation could not be erased without explanation, and explanations invited questions. As whispers spread through the officer corps about Germany's future, Rommel's name surfaced repeatedly, not as a conspirator, but as a symbol of what professional command could look like after catastrophe. That was enough. In the logic of a collapsing dictatorship, symbols become targets, neutrality becomes suspicion, distance becomes guilt. Rommel did not need to act to be implicated. His independence alone was sufficient. He had crossed an invisible line, not by opposing Hitler directly, but by refusing to surrender his judgment. By the summer of 1944, he was no longer simply a general with disagreements. He was a liability the regime did not know how to manage. Trust had not just eroded, it had inverted. Where Hitler once saw usefulness, he now saw risk. Where he once saw loyalty, he now saw unpredictability. And in a system that equated control with survival, unpredictability could not be tolerated. Rommel was still alive, still decorated, still outwardly loyal, but he was no longer safe. The final rupture between Erwin Rommel and Adolf Hitler did not come with a dramatic confrontation or an open accusation. It came through silence, implication, and inevitability. By the summer of 1944, trust had already collapsed. What remained was a question the regime could no longer avoid. What to do with a man who was respected, realistic, and no longer controllable? Rommel's injury in July 1944 removed him physically from command, but it did not remove him from suspicion. In Berlin, paranoia was reaching its peak. The assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20th intensified a climate where proximity mattered less than perception. Rommel's known pessimism, his criticism of rigid orders, and his belief that the war could not be won militarily placed him in a dangerous category. He did not need to be proven guilty. He merely needed to be plausible. Rommel's greatest mistake, in the eyes of the regime, was that he never learned how to pretend. He did not mask his conclusions with ideological language. He did not perform loyalty. He believed that serving Germany meant telling the truth, even when that truth was unwelcome. But by 1944, truth itself had become subversive. Hitler no longer trusted generals who described reality. He trusted only those who reinforced illusion. The regime faced a dilemma. Arresting Rommel publicly would shatter morale and invite questions it could not control. Ignoring him risked allowing his influence to linger. The solution was quiet, calculated, and ruthless. Rommel was given a choice that was no choice at all. preserve his family and his legacy, or face public disgrace and execution. The message was unmistakable. Trust had not only vanished, it had been replaced by fear. Rommel's death was framed as an honorable end. The myth was preserved, but the reality behind it revealed everything about why trust had been withdrawn in the first place. Rommel was not eliminated because he betrayed Hitler. He was eliminated because he stopped believing in him. In a system that demanded absolute faith, disbelief was unforgivable. The irony is that Rommel never sought power, never plotted openly, and never abandoned his sense of duty. He simply refused to abandon reality. That refusal made him incompatible with a leadership that could no longer tolerate it. Trust, once broken, could not be repaired, only resolved. In the end, Rommel's fate was not about conspiracy, it was about control. Hitler did not lose trust in Rommel because Rommel failed. He lost trust because Rommel understood the war was lost, and said so. That was the line that could not be crossed, and once crossed, there was no way back.